Okay. Well, thank you to everyone who has showed up and to those who may join us. It is being recorded, so if people are unable to join us now, we will be able to share it. That way, everybody has access to this really cool talk. So I'm going to introduce myself and our organization, and then I will introduce our speaker. So I am Catherine Dupree, president and co-founder of the Association for Women in Science, or AWIS as we like to call it. Whitney Murchison is our treasurer and co-founder as well. And the Association for Women in Sciences is a national organization, and it works towards equitable workforces and workplaces for women in the sciences through policy, advocacy, research, education, and activism. Our student chapter at the University of Arkansas supports all of those efforts, but we like to focus on creating educational, networking, and outreach opportunities for students on our campus. Our goal is to foster a community of support and provide knowledge and resources needed for women to navigate issues of inequity, specifically in STEM fields. If any of that interests you or this topic interests you that our speaker will be talking about, I encourage you to look up our organization on HogSync, contact Whitney or I about more information, or you can become an officer in AWIS as our elections are about to start. So if you're interested in participating or getting involved, I encourage you to do that as well. Now I am honored to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Lisa Corrigan. Dr. Corrigan is an associate professor of communication, director of the Gender Studies program, and affiliate faculty in both African American Studies and Latin American Studies at the University of Arkansas. She received her bachelor's degree in communication and English literature from the University of Pittsburgh and went on to receive a master's and PhD of rhetoric, political communication, and women's studies from the University of Maryland. She's published 2 books titled Prison Power, How Prison Politics Influenced the Movement of Black Liberation, and Black Feelings, Race and Effect in Long 60s. Finally, she co-hosts a podcast with Laura Weiderhoft called Lean Back, Critical Feminist Conversations, which in 2017 was named the top podcast in Arkansas and one of the top 35 podcasts in the country by Paste Magazine. So now I'm really excited to kind of turn the floor over to Dr. Corrigan. She's going to tell us all about some of the research that she's interested in and educate us about some of these issues.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, Katie and Whitney, for the invitation to chat today. So when they pitched this to me, they were sort of, I asked what you all wanted to know about, because I do all of this race work about civil rights. And my research area is on the civil rights, Black Power movements, and social movements, but I also have a totally separate career as a politico. And so I do political work outside of the university, inside of the community, across the state and across the country on a bunch of different issues. So I was talking a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing lately that sort of focuses on 4 things: mentorship, power, relationships, and resources. So I'm going to chat for about 25 minutes or so, and then open the floor for some conversations, but feel free to drop any questions in the chat or unmute. It's not going to be disruptive to me. So I want to talk a little bit about mentorship, because I think, especially for women in science, it's really, really hard given the disproportionate hoarding of resources by non-women people inside of the university, but also inside of private businesses and in municipal and state level and federal organizations. And so I want to start by talking about the importance of mentors, because mentoring is like a skill set. It's not just like pairing you with some random human who's older than you. And so I think that, mentorship is absolutely the key to moving successfully through a career. And I want to think about it as a couple of things. I want to think about mentoring as relationship building with other people. I want to think about it as sharing skills and scaffolding skills between yourself and others. I want to think about it as an opportunity to heal from social and institutional trauma. I want to think about how its mentoring sometimes functions as domination through networks of patronage, right? Where you're supposed to behave a certain way because this person has the resources and you have to produce this kind of research because that's where the money is. That's called patronage. But also because the domination happens through negative communication routines and patterns, right? That produce verbal and physical domination, but also through a leaky pipeline, right, where women are chased off of a career path and or where they're not supported, and also academic bullying, which is also called workplace mobbing. And that happens a lot in grad school, but it also happens out in the workforce as well. Nonetheless, even though mentoring can take the form of domination, I want to think about it as a framework for learning boundaries, right? This is like my hard no. Here is some stuff that I will put up with, but this is where I have to say no. It's important for learning boundaries. It's important for learning emotional regulation. I got a bunch of feedback on this project and it was negative and I spun out. And so now I can't do my revisions, right? Is not productive emotional regulation. That's dysregulation. So we want to think about mentoring as a way of thinking through emotional regulation and navigating risk and failure and success, as well as an opportunity to build healthy collaborations, because collaborating is a skill set as well. It's like a series of skills, right, that are kind of complicated to work with other people. Finally, I want to think about mentoring as a coalitional politics, right? So obviously we're going to talk about power and privilege and the way that they function in science, but mentoring is fundamentally coalitional. That is, it pushes back against domination and hierarchies of power. It's the only way out of patronage models. It's imperfect. It's sometimes temporary, but occasionally durable. And I think for women in science, it's really important to think about how you can build relationships with other people and scaffold your interests and your talents with other people who don't necessarily have the same skill sets or interests, but you can teach and learn from each other as peers. And finally, I want to think about mentorship, generations, and genealogies. So you're going to run into a bunch of people who are damaged and trouble, and they got that way because they had troubling mentors who damaged them and produced trauma. So how do we skirt that, and how do we manage it once it happens? So I'm glad you asked. I want to think about some things about what does a good mentor look like? What do they do? So good mentors are emotionally regulated, but they're emotionally present, right? So they are with you in the moment and they are not producing chaos. So chaos demons are to be avoided, right? They are red flags. They're only going to produce more dysregulation. Good mentors are emotionally regulated. They're honest with you, right? But not brutal, right? So you can be clear and concise and honest without producing harm, even about things that are potentially hurtful, right? I think that good mentors offer compassion, especially around issues of inequality in the workplace. And they also offer resources and support, material support. But also mentorship goes both ways. So like good mentors are important, but also like you have to be a good mentee. And good mentees are curious and they're open and they're self-reflective and they can manage boundaries in the workplace, right? So, while you might get close with a mentor, there are definitely boundaries about what you should be sharing with your mentor that are not their responsibility to manage emotionally or socially. And so good mentees start learning what those boundaries are and understanding that your work people are not necessarily your friends and your mentors are definitely not your friends. And it's okay that you don't share everything about yourself with people who are in those roles. So, but there are red flags, I think, about mentorship relationships, right? So there are mentors who seem like they might be a good fit on the surface, but then they produce exploitative relationships. So that's quid pro quo, like, if you don't do this thing for me, then I'm not going to do this thing for you. If you do not produce this research for me, or if you do not, do this work that I was assigned, then I'm going to withhold a raise or not write a letter of recommendation or whatever. So exploitation is a red flag of a mentorship relationship, I think. I think that mentorship relationships can get toxic when there's a huge power imbalance in terms of age, especially, and the older mentor is dumping all of their emotional stuff onto mentees. That's bad boundaries. That's toxic. That's not a good relationship. And that happens a lot with personal stuff, right? Like it's just like not mentees should not have to take on the personal, churn of their mentors. And then stealing, like all theft, intellectual property theft, theft of ideas, theft of time, theft of emotional labor, anything that feels thievy is bad. And that's a red flag for sure. But I think the harder question is, how do you build and sustain positive mentorship relationships? Because they kind of come on sometimes fast, especially if they're assigned. But if they're going to be durable, they have to be paced out, right? So it can't just be one person, doing all of the initiating. There has to be some sort of symmetry to a productive, mentorship relationship where both of the parties feel like they're giving and receiving appropriately for their role in that relationship. So I think, positive and productive mentorship relationships that are sustainable are strong because they're paced out slowly, they're consistent, they have clear goals and boundaries that have been communicated, and they are not toxic and asymmetrical. But I mean, everybody has to deal with toxic relationships in the workplace because capitalism is crushing us all. So how do we navigate that? I'm so glad you asked. I think a lot of mentors want to try and control mentees because they themselves are very anxious about whatever the thing is, the project, the job, timelines, whatever. And so they produce control, but then they gaslight about it as care. Like, I'm only driving you this hard because I care so much about you. So if it sounds like a bad marriage script, it's bad, right? So if you're like, I don't, this feels weird. Why are you talking to me this way? That's because anxiety produces this want to control and hyper manage and be hyper vigilant about the advisee. And that's for sure a problem. And so I think that the way that you navigate that hyper control and that form of domination is to make sure that you have other people who see you interacting with your mentors, especially the mentors you're not choosing. So there have to be witnesses to your relationship to get external eyes on those people to make sure that they're not just doing things behind the scenes. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Because what happens in a lot of workplaces, higher ed is full of this, but this workplace mobbing where somebody starts some gossip and then they get somebody in on it, and then they pick and pick and pick at somebody because they're successful, they're an overproducer, they have an identity that is non-normative to the institution, and so they all gang up on that person, and sometimes it's gentle and sometimes it's really rough, but all of it is workplace mobbing. And I think that the way to do that is to create durable connections with other people who are both peers and mentors to try and manage the toxic, a spillover of that kind of relationship. So, but there are barriers to that, especially in grad school. And I think one of the things that happens in higher ed is that people become codependent with other peers, right? So they don't know how to manage relationships with mentors who are older, and so they become really enmeshed with their peers, so they overshare with them, and they're producing and reinforcing the trauma of education or the workplace, and they become so enmeshed that they are taking on and just creating a closed feedback loop of trauma and anxiety and chaos. And that happens all the time, and it is unhelpful and it's hard to get out of. So I think that kind of enmeshment with peers as a substitute for healthy mentorship relationships is a barrier. I think passive aggressiveness as a style is a barrier. So, straight talk, white people are not very good at it, but it's essential. It is essential to be able to say the thing. I do not want this. I do want this. I do not like this. I do like this. I want more of this. I want more less of this, less of this. I mean, you have to have a vocabulary of saying what you want, what you don't want, in order to get the things that you need. I think jealousy is a barrier to good mentorship and good relationships in general. And I think there's just one takeaway about jealousy. It's that you should do whatever you can to not indulge in it because it's super, super toxic internally. And it's hard to overcome if that's the way that you see yourself in relationship to other people. And it also produces that kind of workplace mobbing. In higher ed, for sure, there's gatekeeping. So it's like, oh, well, you have to learn all of this stuff before you can talk about that. Or like, nobody that young does this. Or we've never had somebody like X do that. All of that is gatekeeping. It happens around publishing, it happens around grants, it happens around job opportunities, letters of reference. It happens in all those things. And so the gatekeeping is totally a barrier to good mentorship. I think too that a lot of mentors see mentees as resources. I think of it like fracking, right? They're just going to take out all of the good ideas and energy from their mentee and then just put dirt water basically back into them. And I think that kind of extractive capital, that idea that mentees are something that just produces labor for the mentor that can be taken at will, is a super red flag and a barrier, because it's what justifies the theft, intellectual theft, social theft, right? And then finally, in terms of barriers to good mentorship, I would say perceived scarcity. So that's going to be hard for your generation because sometimes the scarcity is real and sometimes it's not. But especially for white people, it is not. Scarcity is not going to be a thing for the most part. We're not in the global South. White people's incomes are massively higher than everybody else. So one thing that's very toxic is when white people are producing fear of scarcity and it's not actually happening. And then they use that to mob or to bully or to produce discriminatory things. So don't think about scarcity or produce scarcity if it's not a real material feature. And, institutions are this way. So it's like, oh, a cut may come. We should cut our budget first. It's like, don't cut before the cuts happen, right? Don't impose the austerity on yourself just because you're worried that it's happening. So some ways to think about mentorship and relationality and resources, I think, for women is to move away from single institution, single mentor relationships. So I think it's really important to have peer mentors that are in different areas than you. I think it's important to have mentors who are older that are not just in the workplace, but ideally they're in all the parts of your life that are important, right? So whether that's spiritual or if it's social or whatever, you would have different kinds of people that you're cultivating through the entire life cycle, right? That you can count on to teach you stuff. I think, that is not the model of relationality for a lot of communities in the United States. And that's why, our parents are really lonely and haven't made friends as an adult ever, right? So they are locked away in their man caves or their lady sheds, and they don't make friends as adult people because they stopped producing the skill set where you can do vulnerability and collaboration and honesty and openness and boundaries with peers. So it's really important, I think, to move away from like, I have one mentor and that's like my source of information, and into this idea that there are abundance, right? Not scarcity of resources for you to consult and learn from that are comfortable and healthy relationships. So that is essential. I think we need to think through both investment and divestment. So people who are interested in diversity, equity, inclusion work especially need to think about power and privilege to both divest resources from white supremacist capitalist institutions and then reinvest them with people who are good stewards of those resources in the communities that are most affected by, oppression and domination. So think about, how am I divesting privilege and power, and where am I reinvesting it, right, to help people? I think, and I think that that's the case as you scaffold, relationships with other kinds of people in different kinds of places. And also obviously coalitions. So, it's hard to be a woman in science and not think about politics because it's everywhere and it's constant, it's embodied and it's structural and it's all at the same time. It's interpersonal, but it's also in, the entire structures in which you find yourselves learning and working and what have you. So I want to also talk about resources. So there's a part of this talk that's called Things I Wish People Had Told Me, which in general I like to add to talks. Like, I wish somebody had told me that everything was negotiable, because it is. Everything is negotiable. Your first job offer is negotiable. Your starting salary is negotiable. Your fringe benefits are negotiable. Your workload is negotiable. Whether you work in the building or not is almost everything is negotiable. And so that means you have to learn how to negotiate. It's a serious skill set, especially if you're going to science. 2, I think most advice especially for mentors, should be checked by 2 independent sources, especially when the junior person has major money or time at stake. So if a senior person gives you advice, do not just take their word for it, even if they're right a bunch. Go and get more information, especially if you have money on the table or time invested. Third, sometimes your intuition is a good barometer. If it feels weird and gross and you don't want to do it, don't do it. Just stop doing it. If it feels gross, don't do it. Even if there's risk to that, it's still more healthy for you to say no. Saying no is like the most important boundary, very close to saying yes. And we are bad at both as a culture. 4, do not risk your safety for an opportunity, whether it's physical safety, mental safety, or emotional safety. I think women in science is because it is so sexist and racist in lots of ways. There is no sense about how to navigate risk. And I'm somebody who believes a lot in the importance of taking risk as a way of producing personal and political growth. But also, if it's going to compromise your material self, don't do that. I would say 5th, that scarcity is often but not always manufactured. I think that there is a lot of work to be done to produce equity, inclusion, access, and diversity in science. And that means that there are not enough people doing that work. So if that's what you're passionate about, all hands on deck. Not everybody's perfect, but there is so much work to go around. It's inexcusable to not let people who are good faith actors come to the table to produce a more equitable place. And then finally, I would say be wary of cliques. So cliques are a really good way to sort of, I don't know, chase somebody out of a herd where they can be harmed or workplace mobbed or what have you. So I would be very wary of cliques, even though it's really important to have, external support. And with that, I would say here's some things I just want to tell you that nobody could have told me, because these are sort of theories that I have developed as like a person who does politics in a lot of different spaces and thinks a lot about how to make places more equitable. So first, external accountability insulates people who are junior, whether that's junior in the academy or junior in the workplace. So the way that you prevent harm is to make sure that somebody who might harm you knows that there are people above them who are standing you and supporting you. So it's important to know where your network is, and it's important to know when to make it visible, because external accountability is what provides a check against harm. So if your boss is terrible to you, but their boss loves you, it's really important to make sure that your boss, who's producing a toxic workplace, is totally aware that their boss, right, will punish them if you complain. So it's important to have external checks on people who are producing harm, because it insulates you from blowback. 2, I would say relationships are really sustaining beyond just where you find yourself. So if you're a chemist, the biologists have ideas about chemistry that maybe don't jive with what you're interested in, but can be really sustaining and teaching you creative and useful ways to think about your own work. So I just had a woman guest lecture in my class who's an art historian. I don't know anything about that. And so she was like, what's happening here? And I had all this vocabulary as a critical theorist that she had never read or had access to, that just like, right, blew her mind. And we had this like fantastic exchange because we're coming from totally different perspectives. So that is where like you are going to generate lots of ideas and impulses and curiosities that are going to be life sustaining across the entirety of your life. So, invest in relationship building. 3, you have agency. So try not to fall prey to the idea that you just have to go with the flow. Be intentional about your choices, about who you work with, where you work, where you live, who you live with. Be intentional about those things. Don't just go with the flow. 5, be yourself. A lot of the structures that you're going to find yourself in as a woman in science are going to ask you to be someone else. They would prefer that you were anybody else, but don't do that. The work is not worth it. It's much easier to carve out the space of being authentic so that you're not constantly at war with yourself about who you should be. 5th, I would say, women in science are all smart, but many of them are not kind. So be kind, because that's how you build the networks that will sustain you and won't get you snowed under by workplace mobbing. And I would say finally, generosity is the path forward and abuse is always wrong. Those are some things that I've been thinking about. So I promised that I would go about 30 minutes and then open sort of the floor for questions or comments about anything. I have other stuff to talk about. So I'm happy to talk about money and how to negotiate, because I feel like there could be some good questions there. And so I have a ton of stuff to say about that, but also happy to talk about mentorship or relationship building or the job market or your first job or any of those sorts of things. I'm sort of interested in what you would like to talk about. So I will turn it back to you, Katie, to see if you have some feedback there or a question to start us off with, or if other folks want to jump in.
Sure. Well, we did actually intend to host a seminar a couple weeks back specifically regarding negotiating salary and the how to negotiate. And we weren't able to have that event. Our attendance just didn't work out. So I would love if you could touch on that. I think that would be great.
Okay, so negotiation is entirely about the production of leverage. So in order to get stuff, you have to produce things first. It never goes the other way. So if you have your first job offer and they've already made you the offer, that's an opportunity to negotiate. There's no point where they make you an offer, you counter, and they're like, we don't want you. That's like not a thing. So as long as you're a good faith negotiator, you always, always, always have to counter. You always have to counter. So that's number one. Number two, we want to start at the end, because no matter what their final offer is, you always add $500 because it's a negligible amount of money. You will always get it. And what is that? $50 a month for groceries, right? Like $42 a month for groceries. So that is, you always ask for 500 more at the end of the negotiation and say, add 500 more and I'll sign today. And they will give that to you. Okay. So that's the beginning and the end of the negotiation. The in between is where things get hard, especially for a first position with an organization that you don't have relationships with. So know that if they're offering you the job, they want to give you the job, right? So negotiations, when they're solid, produce two wins. They produce a win for whoever's hiring, and they produce a win for whoever's negotiating the hire. Good negotiations always produce a double win. Bad negotiations or negotiations go wrong when a win cannot be produced for either side. So in order for people to say yes to you, you have to ask for things that they can give you. So you can't ask for things that don't necessarily have a precedent, right? So if they're like, in the 50 years of this company, we have always refused X, you are not going to be the first that gets the X. You're not, unless you produce something above and beyond where they can justify doing the thing, right? So if there's no precedent for the thing that you're asking for, you are not going to get it. So it's important to have a sense about what people ask for. So obviously they ask about salary. They also ask about vacation. Benefits are generally untouchable because those are negotiated in a totally different fashion. But you can get resources, in the academy, which is where I work, there are lots of things you can negotiate for leave time. You can negotiate for course releases. You can negotiate for RAs and support. You can ask for support staff. You can ask for travel money. There are lots and lots of things, endowed chairs, centers. I mean, you can ask for all kinds of stuff, grant money, subvention grants, right, for publication. Like there are lots of things that you can ask for. And in some workplaces, there are lots of things you can ask for and some that they're very narrow. So it's important to have a sense from your mentors about what kinds of things are reasonable to negotiate about in that kind of place. But I also want to talk about a different kind of thing, which is I have 2 job offers, right? So like that's hot because then you can play them off of each other. So I'm negotiating. The woman who taught in my class last night has 2 offers. So I met with her and was like, okay, this is how you negotiate them. And she was like, well, what do you think about this offer? I'm like, that's a terrible offer. And she's like, what about this second offer? And I'm like, that's a great offer. Also, offer 2 does not know the offer 1 is a terrible offer. So you want to leverage offer 1 against offer 2 to get a better deal out of number 2. How do you do that, Lisa? I'm so glad you asked. You do it by saying offer 1 has all of these things. It gives me this kind of flexibility. It gives me this kind of research leave. It gives me this length of a contract, right? So this one is a 3-year contract. This one is only 2. Make this one match this one, right? So if anytime you have 2 offers, you create a chart of those 2 offers, and every aspect of them And then whichever one you're leveraging against, you take everything positive here and leverage it for more for the second one that's a good offer. So that's salary, and that's length of the contract, and that's course by whatever it is, right? You have to leverage. And sometimes they get into a bidding war. And so you can take, right? So offer one is leverage against offer two. Offer two comes to the table. You tell offer one, they're like, well, but we want that, right? So the best case scenario is when they are coming for you and they want to cultivate you as a resource. So that's very different than I applied online to a job that got 10,000 applications. There's no leverage in that. That is a buyer's market. You have no leverage. There's nothing. That's entry level. You got nothing. But if they're coming to you and they're like, we really want you for this job, then that is the best case for negotiation because they're already wanting to cultivate you as an asset. And so you can ask for more because that's the best position you're ever going to be in as a worker, is to have them cultivating your labor. So is that helpful as a start, Katie?
Yes, I think so. Definitely.
I don't know if there are follow-up questions about that or about how to negotiate or how to think about money, how to invest money. Those are
Yeah,
all.
if anyone has questions, just unmute your mic and or send it in the chat. One of us will read it.
I had some questions back more towards like when we were talking about mentoring and stuff like that. So you mentioned like the power dynamics that obviously exist. Like I think everyone in this chat that I know is a grad student. So sometimes it's like the power dynamic is so huge between an advisor and the graduate student. So kind of, you know, you're talking about, oh, well, there's people above them and hold them accountable, and you have the right to say no, this and that. So like, can you maybe be more specific about how grad students, maybe specifically, or people in this type of power dynamic can operate or potentially like try to guide their mentor in a way that they want them to act when they really don't have any power to do so?
I mean, it's both true that you have less power and it's also true that you have more, because the university sees you as the consumer and they see us as inefficient pests. So you have much more political power on campus as an individual and as a group than an individual faculty member does, actually, like as an objective fact. So the faculty, for the most part, are kind of aware of that. So you have more power in a group to stop actual material harm. But in terms of getting your advisor to do the things that you want, it depends on what their style is in navigating power. So I think that there is a lot of abusive power that is not going to be held accountable, right? Because it's undocumented, it's not discussed. We don't, students don't have that vocabulary about it. Like gaslighting isn't going to get a professor fired, right? But naming things as gaslighting provides a different perspective on power that often is not discussed. So in the Obama White House, for example, the Black women on his staff would find that they would give an idea at the table, right, at like a meeting, and somebody would talk over them and then take credit for their idea. So they started doing something called amplification. So it's like, I really love what Carla said. Oh yeah, I too love what Carla said. Carla, that's a great idea. So they just pile on. So you have to back channel that with your colleagues and be like, this is garbage. We want to do a different thing. And so then Whitney says a thing, and then Katie's like, I just really agree with Whitney. I think that this would be great. I saw my mentor says, Dr. Corrigan says, right? And so if you have mentors external, right? People are afraid of being not cool. They're afraid of being called out. They're afraid of being, looking bad. They're afraid of all kinds of things. So you have to know what is the lever with the individual person. If they're like, oh, Corrigan does gender studies stuff and they're saying some gender things, like, well, my mentor, Dr. Corrigan, came to AWIS and she had things to say about it. Throw me under the bus. Nobody's coming for me. I'm a full professor, right? So you have to find the people external to you that can create a sense of like, well, you have to make it more expensive for them to mess with you than not. So if somebody's like, well, Whitney, I mean, I could push her on this, but I know she's going to stir up the hornet's nest, then they're not going to do the thing. without you actually having to stir the hornet's nest. So that means you have the vocabulary, you're not afraid of negotiating, you're clear about who you are and what your boundaries are, you have a good sense of where you're going. All of that takes a pretty secure self, which is why I'm saying stay away from the emotionally dysregulated adult people, because they're going to wreck you internally. Like, it is not good for you. Sometimes you can't avoid them, but you have to compartmentalize them and disengage as much as possible. But I think it really depends on, who the person is and what their strategy. Some of them just explode. That's not helpful, right? If you're just torching, right, the adults on fire, that doesn't get you closer to what you want. And so I think you have to create external leverage and external accountability. You have to create a sense that you have solidarity with you in, a crew of humans who are like-minded. And I think that you have a vocabulary and sense of self-assurance that you're going to describe the thing the way that you see it, and that's how it is. So that's why, especially with DEI work, right, diversity, equity, inclusion, access stuff, it's really important to have vocabularies to describe harm, because the boomers and the old people, they don't have the vocabulary. So they're just reproducing terrible communication patterns that they've internalized. They're not even thinking about it. You don't even exist to them that way. Like, they wouldn't even perceive the harm. Or, not to pathologize, but there are a bunch of sociopaths who enjoy the harm. So steer clear of them if you can.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. That's very helpful. I had kind of a follow-up question to that when you mentioned, like, you talked a little bit about having people, like not just having a single mentor and having multiple. And I hear that a lot, but then I've always found like, oh, that seems difficult. Like, how do you get someone to invest their time in you, especially when like they're not like, as the traditional grad school way is like, you are this person and you have one mentor, right? So then you have to then, and that mentor at least has agreed somewhat to be your mentor. So then like, how do you navigate finding more mentors, especially when everyone, especially in academia and women in particular, always seem like, oh, just burnt out. They have more on their plate than other people. Like, when they're not required to mentor you, how do you get someone to mentor you?
Okay, there are two paths. Food is always a path, right? So if you're showing up at an 8 a.m. meeting and you know that your advisor's slammed, it would just be polite to bring a donut. Even if they don't want it or don't eat it, you are trying to feed them, knowing that they are lacking sustenance in capitalism. So that is very sensible. And I say that not because you need to spend the money. It's about paying attention to the fact that they are overburdened with massive amounts of labor. Also, they want to help you. So thank you notes are absolutely essential, especially in the first 10 years of your career. Writing a handwritten thank you note, following with an email, thanks so much for doing X, Y, and Z. Nobody pays people to mentor, and the women are doing all of it. So you have got to do gratitude about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and you cannot ghost. You cannot ghost your mentors. You cannot just disappear. It is the most destructive communication thing to do, is to avoid after somebody's already put a ton of time into you, especially if they've been working with you for 6 months or more. It is so disrespectful and so destructive and so unethical. So don't do that. And also follow up with thank you notes and gratitude, like genuine gratitude, right? Like, you can say, I know you're snowed under and you're juggling all this stuff, and I still appreciate that you had 30 minutes to grab a coffee with me to talk through, my thesis intro. Or like, I know I turned this in 5 days late and put you under a deadline to get me revisions. I'm super sorry. And I really appreciate you, and I will do better. Like, you have to describe yourself and your feelings with integrity to maintain those relationships. And then they will last for a long time. The only reasons they fall apart is because people sabotage them. So don't sabotage them. Mm-hmm. And people do that because it's a trauma response because their parents are jerks. And I get that. But also, it's very hard for the adults to work through the trauma if you withdraw and avoid and sabotage. So at least be aware of that in yourself and try not to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I don't know you, Whitney, at all. So this is not germane to you personally. But
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Other questions or comments or thoughts?
I hear nothing. Are there any other tips, advice, best practices that you would recommend, not just for the sciences, but just kind of putting your foot in the door with any opportunity.
Yeah,
That would be a good way to end it.
I would survey the landscape before you decide who you're going to pal up with. So clicks are bad, and when you start them, you can't get out of them. So I would say approach any new workplace with an air of distance and pleasantness for the first year, because you don't know where the bodies are buried, and you don't want to get sucked up by the sociopaths or the domineering people or outcasts. So the best thing to do is be consistently pleasant and neutral about as much as you can. I mean, it's until you figure out what the lay of the land is in terms of how the power dynamics work, because otherwise you're going to get sucked into stuff and it's going to have long-term ramifications and you won't even know that it's happening to you. So, and never gossip. So if you're the new person at work, gossip is what is going to get you destroyed, because you don't know who's listening and who's telling and who's leaking information. You have no idea where that information is coming from or going, so do not spread it around. It's a terrible idea. I mean, gossip is, there's a lot of actually really good data that gossip is sort of the language of the unheard. It's a sort of infra-politics, and that's not totally wrong, right? If you think about holiday dinners where all the women are cooking in the hetero families in the kitchen, they're spreading around a bunch of information about who gets divorced and who should get divorced and how people are raising their kids and who got a therapist. I mean, they're sharing all kinds of like real talk, okay? But gossip in the workplace is only used to destroy, and it's mostly exclusively targeted at women. So if you participate in that, it's going to come around and get you. So stay away from that. It is bad practice. Don't do it.
That's good advice.
Very good advice. Well, I will follow up on some of the topics that we touched on. I think I'll just provide some resources kind of related to that I know of that we have on our campus.
So I would say Kate Stahl at Stanford has a bunch of videos about negotiating and about job stuff and leverage. And I think those are some of the best on the internet right now that are short and, they're sort of mini TED Talks, but she's a boss and it's worth absolutely watching her videos and reading through some of her published work, online published work about negotiating. She is like, I think, the gold standard.
All right, nice. Yeah, I'll definitely look into that. So just plugging in response to, getting more people on your side, grad students have collective power. For anyone who doesn't know, and I know Grace isn't a grad student, but she is going to medical school. So this is something to remember. Here on our campus, we have the Graduate Professional Student Congress. That is an elected student collective with an executive branch that represents all of grad students to the administration and help develop policies to protect students. If you would like more information about that, I am a member of the Graduate Professional Student Congress, so I can tell you more about that. That is a powerful tool that you can use as an external check to some of the abuses that we see here. I'm also putting out a graduate student mental health survey. It's out there collecting data on exactly what we were talking about: bullying, harassment, discrimination, and it's all anonymous. So that's also going to be going through GPSC in order to create a report that says action has to happen, because data is what drives change. So that is out there, and I can also give you more information about that. Lastly, AWIS is co-sponsoring another event this Friday in kind of, sorry, that's my dog, celebration or recognition of sexual assault this month. And it is a demonstration of support for survivors on our campus. It is this Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. on the Poultry Science Hillside. So that's right off of Maple. And we will have guest speakers, a student open mic, poster making, and a flag display that we will hopefully be able to put in the next to the union so people will be able to see it. So I encourage you to learn more about Dr. Corrigan's work and listen to her podcast because it's good. And then get more involved with the Graduate Professional Student Congress or student organizations that will represent you and support you, because those are great ways to make connections and find mentors, and just create a supportive network for you to be able to make your experience the best that it can be. So I will let Dr. Corrigan sum up anything that she would like. Otherwise, yeah, thank you for coming.
I'm happy to be here. I would say GPSC, I was the original faculty advisor and helped shepherd it through to get approval for years and years. And I would just say that that is a really fantastic place to do professionalization and to understand how organizational power works. It's good for networking, and it really is a good exposure for understanding how decision making happens. So I really just cannot overstate how important that opportunity is, and how few women, and also women of color and trans women are participating in faculty governance, staff governance, or student governance on campus. So the more voices there, the better. And I really just cannot plug it enough as a professional development opportunity. But this has been lovely. I appreciate your time. I know everybody's zoomed out. It was thoughtful of you to reach out for me. Please call on me again at some point, although I'm on sabbatical next year. And anybody feel free to circle back with any questions on the email. Otherwise, take care of yourselves. And good luck finishing your semesters.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah,
Cheers.
I learned a lot.
It was a really great conversation.
Oh, good. Thank you. I'm so glad. I hope it was useful.
It was, for sure.
Good. I'm glad.
Feel free to follow up. My door is always open.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye,
I'm gonna.
I'll wait till everybody leaves.
Katie, do you know how to get a recording from Zoom?
I think once you stop recording, you'll be able to